We're about to step into the workshops, homes, and daily lives of the people who actually created ancient Egypt's most breathtaking treasures. These weren't the pharaohs or the priests whose names echo through history, but the anonymous goldsmiths, stone carvers, painters, and craftsmen whose skilled hands turned raw materials into objects that still leave us speechless thousands of years later. This is their story, told through the evidence they left behind in their villages, their tools, and the incredible masterpieces that have survived the ages. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. So here's a question that might seem simple at first. Who actually made all those stunning golden masks? Those massive stone sarcophagi? Those perfectly painted tomb walls we associate with ancient Egypt? When you think about it, someone had to spend days, weeks, months, sometimes years, perfecting every single detail. Someone had to know exactly how to mix the perfect blue pigment, how to carve granite without shattering it, how to hammer gold into sheets so thin you could almost see through them. These weren't magic tricks or alien technology, like some people want to believe. These were human beings with families and homes and bad days at work, who just happened to be incredibly, almost impossibly good at what they did. Let me take you to a place that gives us more answers than almost anywhere else in Egypt. Picture this. It's a blazing hot day around 1450 BC, and you're walking through a narrow street in a small village tucked into the desert hills west of the Nile. The village is called Set Mart, which means the place of truth, though we know it today as Deir el-Medina. This isn't some massive city. It's actually pretty small, maybe 68 houses packed together in a tight little community surrounded by a wall. But the people who live here, they're not ordinary farmers or soldiers. Every single person in this village is connected to the most important artistic project in all of Egypt, building and decorating the tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. The houses here are built from mud brick on stone foundations, and they're small by our standards, maybe around 400 square feet total. Imagine trying to fit your whole extended family, maybe even a servant or two, into a space about the size of a modern studio apartment. But these homes were cleverly designed for the brutal Egyptian climate. Small, high windows instead of large ones kept the heat out during summer and trapped warmth inside during surprisingly cold desert nights. The wooden ceilings, long since turned to dust, were once supported by wooden columns that some families plastered and painted with their own decorative touches. Walk into one of these houses and you'd typically pass through 3 or 4 rooms. At the back, you'd find the kitchen, and let me tell you, this was probably the most uncomfortable room in the house. Hot, smoky from cooking fires, filled with the smell of baking bread and brewing beer. You can still see some of the stone mortars they used for pounding grain, worn smooth by thousands of repetitions. Many families carved out little shrines in their homes, tiny chapels to their favorite gods. After a long day carving hieroglyphs into stone or mixing pigments, they'd come home and pray to Hathor or Ptah or Bes for protection and good fortune. But here's what makes this village absolutely extraordinary for understanding ancient Egyptian artisans. The people who lived here couldn't just come and go as they pleased. Think about why for a second. These workers knew exactly where every pharaoh's tomb was located. They knew the secret entrances, the hidden chambers, where the treasures would be placed. If that information got out to tomb robbers, it would be a disaster. So the village was essentially a controlled community. People were born here, grew up here, learned their trades here, and often died here. It was an unusual kind of life, isolated but also incredibly privileged in its own way. These artisans were basically middle-class state employees, which was actually a pretty good position to be in. They weren't slaves, not by any stretch. They weren't poor peasants. They were skilled workers who got regular pay and rations. And here's something fascinating. Many of them could read and write, which was super rare in ancient Egypt. See, to paint hieroglyphs correctly, you had to understand what they meant. You couldn't just copy symbols without knowing their meaning and get them right. So literacy rates in this village were probably higher than almost anywhere else in Egypt outside of scribal schools. The work week back then was 8 days, not 7. Artisans would work 2 4-hour shifts, which honestly sounds pretty reasonable. Until you remember they were working in tombs carved deep into solid rock, in the dark, with just oil lamps for light, breathing in stone dust and paint fumes. Then they got 2 days off. And what did they do with their time off? A lot of them worked on their own tombs. Yes, you read that right. These guys spent their weekends building their own burial places, decorating them with the same techniques they used for the pharaohs, just on a smaller scale. Some of these artisan tombs have survived, and they're absolutely beautiful, showing that even people of modest means could have stunning eternal resting places if they had the skills to make them. Now, we know all this incredibly specific detail about their lives because of something called ostraka. These are basically ancient Egyptian scratch paper, pieces of broken limestone or pottery that people used to jot down notes. And the people of Deir el-Medina threw these away in absolutely massive quantities. Tens of thousands of ostraka were found in one big pit behind the temple, like an ancient landfill of information. These weren't formal documents on expensive papyrus. These were the everyday scraps, shopping lists, attendance records, personal letters, divorce documents, medical prescriptions, even complaints and insults. One ostrakon records worker absences, and the excuses are hilariously relatable even today. One guy didn't show up because he was hungover from drinking too much the night before. Another was brewing beer. Someone else was embalming his brother. Another got bitten by a scorpion. These little details bring these people to life in a way that formal royal inscriptions never could. They weren't just skilled workers. They were real people who got drunk, who had family emergencies, who occasionally just didn't feel like working. Some ostraka show artistic doodles and sketches. There's one showing a female dancer bent over backwards in this incredibly athletic pose. Another shows a bald stonemason with stubble. hunched over his work with his chisel and mallet. Some are cartoonish drawings of animals acting like humans, like ancient Egyptian comic strips. These little artworks tell us that creativity didn't stop when the workday ended. These artisans drew for fun, for practice, for the pure joy of it. Other ostraca are more official. One piece that's now in the Louvre records work done in the Valley of the Kings. It notes which day's workers were issued their bronze chisels, which were expensive and carefully tracked. It mentions that one worker broke his chisel, which was probably a big deal that would have to be explained. It also records that on days 6 and 7 of 1 month, the entire workforce attended a funeral, so no work was done. These records show how carefully organized everything was. This wasn't chaotic. It was more like an ancient production line with quality control and inventory management. Let's talk about payment, because this is where things get really interesting. There was no money in ancient Egypt, at least not the way we think of it. Everything ran on a barter system. But for workers, payment usually came in the form of rations. The standard basic wage was 10 loaves of bread and 1/3 to 2 full jugs of beer per day. Now, before you think that sounds great, remember that beer was a lot thicker and more nutritious back then, almost like liquid bread. It was a major source of calories and nutrition, not just something to drink at parties. But skilled artisans made more than the basics. Records show that different workers got different amounts based on their skills and positions. A foreman might get more grain, more beer, maybe some oil for lamps, some meat on special occasions. They also received monthly rations that might include around 110 litres of barley. Some of this they'd use themselves, and some they could brew into beer to trade for other goods. It was a whole economy running on beer, bread, and bartering. There's actually a record of one of the first labour strikes in history happening at Deir el-Medina. Late in the reign of Ramesses III, around 1170 BC, the rations stopped coming on time. The workers, hungry and frustrated, did something radical. They stopped work and marched to the temples to protest. They sat down and refused to move until they got their back pay. And it worked. The government officials scrambled to get them their rations. This tells us these workers knew their value and weren't afraid to demand fair treatment. Now, let's get into the actual crafts themselves, because this is where things get absolutely mind-blowing. Let's start with the goldsmiths, because ancient Egypt was, in many ways, defined by gold. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, because of the dark, rich soil along the Nile. But they had access to some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world, especially in Nubia to the south. Gold wasn't rare for them the way it is for us. It was still precious, still valuable, but they had enough of it to do things that seem almost impossible today. A goldsmith in ancient Egypt would start his day in a workshop that might be attached to a temple or a royal palace, or even part of his own home. The tools seem almost primitive to us. Polished stone hammers, simple bronze chisels, blowpipes for heating, and crucibles for melting. But with these basic tools, they created objects of stunning complexity. One of the most impressive techniques was hammering gold into sheets so thin they were almost transparent. This required incredible patience and skill. You'd start with a lump of gold, heat it to make it more malleable, then hammer it carefully, evenly, turning it constantly. Too much force and you'd tear it. Uneven pressure and you'd get thick spots and thin spots. But a master goldsmith could create gold leaf thin enough that when you laid it over a wooden statue, it would conform to every tiny detail of the carving underneath. They also developed a technique called granulation, where tiny balls of gold, sometimes smaller than grains of sand, were arranged in patterns and then fused to a gold backing. How did they make the tiny balls? By heating small pieces of gold on a layer of charcoal until surface tension pulled them into perfect spheres. How did they attach them without melting them completely? Probably using a copper salt solution that would create a bond when heated. The result was jewellery with texture and dimension that caught the light in magical ways. Then there's cloisonné, which is even more complex. Imagine taking thin strips of gold and bending them into shapes, creating little cells or compartments on a gold backing. Then filling those cells with semi-precious stones cut to fit perfectly, or with coloured glass, or with faience, a glazed ceramic material the Egyptians invented. The result is something like the famous pectorals, those big decorative chest pieces that pharaohs and nobles wore. Each one might contain hundreds of pieces, all fitted together with absolute precision. Think about making one of these pectorals. You're a goldsmith, and you've been commissioned to create a piece for, say, a princess. You start with the design, maybe sketching it out on an ostrakon or a piece of papyrus. The design has to be meaningful, incorporating the right symbols and gods for protection and power. Then you start fabricating. You need to hammer out the gold backing, create all those tiny cloisons, cut and polish dozens of pieces of carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and obsidian. Each stone has to fit perfectly. If one piece is even slightly wrong, it throws off the whole design. And here's the thing that really gets me. They didn't have precise measuring tools like we do. No calipers, no rulers marked in millimeters. They relied on their eyes, their experience, and probably wooden or string templates. They'd test fit pieces over and over, grinding them down tiny bit by tiny bit until everything locked together perfectly. One pectoral might take months of work, and if you messed up near the end, you might have to start over from scratch. The goldsmith also had to know metallurgy. Pure gold is actually pretty soft, so for some items they'd create alloys by mixing gold with silver or copper. This made the metal harder and more durable, and it could also create different colours. Egyptian bronze, for example, was typically about 88% copper and 12% tin, creating a harder material perfect for tools and weapons. For jewellery, they might add silver to gold to create electrum, which has a lighter, almost greenish gold colour that was highly prized. One technique that still amazes archaeologists is the lost wax casting method. Here's how it worked. The artisan would sculpt the object they wanted in wax, creating every detail perfectly. Then they'd cover the wax model in clay, leaving channels for the metal to pour in. Once the clay dried and hardened, they'd heat the whole thing. The wax would melt and drain out, leaving a perfect hollow mould inside the clay. Then they'd pour molten gold or bronze into that space. After it cooled, they'd break away the clay mould, and there was their object, capturing every single detail from the original wax model. This technique allowed them to create incredibly complex forms that would be almost impossible to carve directly. Now, let's talk about the stone carvers, because if gold work was about delicacy and precision, stone carving was about strength, endurance, and an almost superhuman level of patience. Imagine you're a stone carver tasked with creating a sarcophagus for a pharaoh. Not just any sarcophagus, but one made from granite, one of the hardest stones in Egypt. You start with a massive block of stone, maybe quarried from Aswan hundreds of miles away and transported on boats down the Nile. This block might weigh several tons. Your job is to transform this rough stone into a perfectly smooth box with walls of even thickness, carved inside and out with hieroglyphs and images of gods. And you have to do this without shattering the stone or making any major mistakes, because this is for a pharaoh and perfection is expected. The tools available to you seem almost laughably inadequate for the task. For hard stones like granite, you can't use copper or bronze chisels alone because they're too soft. Instead, you rely on even harder stones like dolerite, shaped into pounders, basically stone hammers. You'd spend hours, days, weeks, pounding away at the granite, literally pulverizing it bit by bit. The noise would be deafening. Your hands would be calloused and scarred. The dust would coat everything, getting in your eyes, your throat, your lungs. For certain operations, like drilling holes or sawing channels, you'd use copper tools. But here's the secret. The copper tool itself doesn't cut the stone. Instead, you'd pour an abrasive material like quartz sand or even powdered corundum into the cut. As you moved the copper saw or drill back and forth, the hard sand particles would be the actual cutting agent, grinding away at the stone while the copper just guided them. It's genius when you think about it, but incredibly slow. A single drill hole might take days to complete. For softer stones like limestone or sandstone, life was a bit easier. You could use copper chisels more effectively, though you'd still need stone tools for the heavy roughing out. Many tomb walls show scenes of sculptors at work, and we can see their techniques. They'd start by using measuring chords and squares to mark out the design. Then they'd use a pointed chisel to outline the figures and hieroglyphs. Next came the carving itself. Ancient Egyptian stone carvers mastered two main types of relief carving: high relief and low relief. In high relief, also called raised relief, the figures stand out from the background. The carvers would cut away the stone around the figures, leaving them projecting forward. This created dramatic shadows and made the images really pop, especially in the flickering light of oil lamps inside tombs. But it was also risky because those protruding parts could break off if you weren't careful. Low relief, also called sunk relief, was the opposite. Instead of carving away the background, you'd carve into the surface, creating a depression for each figure. The image would be below the surrounding stone. This was faster, required removing less stone, and the recessed images were protected from damage. It was especially popular for exterior carvings that would be exposed to the elements. You see it all over, temple walls and obelisks. But here's what really shows the skill of these carvers: consistency across massive surfaces. Imagine you're part of a team decorating a tomb wall that's 30 feet long and 12 feet high. Multiple carvers are working on different sections, but when you step back, it all has to look like it was done by one person. The hieroglyphs have to be the same size and depth. The figures have to align properly. The proportions have to match. This required not just individual skill, but incredible coordination, and probably the use of standard templates and constant supervision by a master carver. The polishing stage came last, and this is where good work became great work. Using increasingly fine abrasives, the carvers would rub the stone surface until it was perfectly smooth. On hard stones like granite or basalt, a well-polished surface would become almost glossy, reflecting light like dark glass. This polishing could take as long as the carving itself. It was tedious, repetitive work, but absolutely essential for the final effect. And here's something that blows my mind. Some surviving unfinished works show us that they used a grid system for laying out figures. They'd divide the surface into squares using red paint or cord dipped in red ochre. Then they'd sketch the figure into the grid using standard proportions. An adult human figure might be 18 squares tall, with specific squares designated for the knee, waist, shoulders, and so on. This system allowed apprentices to learn the correct proportions and allowed teams of carvers to maintain consistency. It was an ancient form of technical drawing. Now let's move to the painters, because once the carvers finished, it was time to bring everything to life with colour. The painters of ancient Egypt weren't just slapping on random colours. Every hue had meaning, symbolism, and religious significance. And creating those colours was a craft in itself. The Egyptian colour palette consisted of 6 main colours: red, yellow, blue, green, white, and black. Each one came from different materials and required different preparation methods. Black came from carbon, often from soot or charcoal. It was easy to get and represented death, but also the fertile black soil of the Nile, so it also meant life and rebirth. White came from calcium compounds, like gypsum or chalk, ground into fine powder. It represented purity, sacredness, and was often used for clothing and religious objects. Red came from iron oxide, basically rust in different forms. Red ochre was everywhere in Egypt, easy to find and process. Just grind it up, mix it with a binder, and you had paint that could range from orange red to deep brownish red, depending on the exact source. Red represented life and vitality, but also chaos and destruction. It was the colour of the desert, of Seth, the god of chaos. Yellow also came from ochre, but a different type that contained iron in a different oxidation state. Yellow represented gold, the sun, eternal life. It was the colour of divinity itself. For the deepest, most brilliant yellows, they sometimes used orpiment, a mineral containing arsenic sulfide. Beautiful colour, but toxic to work with. The painters had to be careful not to inhale the dust or get it in cuts. Green came from malachite, a copper carbonate mineral that had to be ground into powder. It represented growth, vegetation, new life, resurrection. In a desert country where green growing things were precious, this colour carried special meaning. The grinding had to be done carefully, because if you ground it too fine, the colour would actually fade. There was an optimal particle size for the most vibrant green, but the most impressive colour, the one that shows Egyptian chemical knowledge more than any other, is blue. Specifically, Egyptian blue, which they invented. This wasn't a natural mineral you could just grind up. This was a synthetic pigment, possibly the first ever created by humans. To make it, you had to heat a mixture of silica, copper compounds, calcium, and an alkali to very specific high temperatures, somewhere around 1,550 to 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit. Get the temperature too low and nothing happens. Too high and you get the wrong colour. The proportions had to be right too. When everything worked perfectly, you got these beautiful blue crystals that could be ground into a stable, vibrant blue pigment. This blue didn't fade. It didn't change colour. It lasted for thousands of years, which is why tomb paintings still look so vivid today. And here's something amazing. Egyptian blue isn't just blue to our eyes. It also reflects infrared light in a way that modern instruments can detect. Researchers today use this property to find hidden Egyptian artworks and to study painting techniques. So you're a painter in a tomb, and you've got your palette of these 6 colours, each one prepared through different processes. How do you turn powder into paint? You need a binder, something to make the pigment stick to the wall and to itself. The Egyptians used a couple of options. One was plant gum, possibly acacia gum, mixed with water. Another was animal glue, made by boiling down connective tissues. Either way, you'd mix your powdered pigment with the binder to create a paint that could be applied with brushes. Those brushes were made from plant fibres, often palm ribs or reeds, beaten at one end to create bristles. For fine detail work, painters might use brushes made from a single reed stem, cut at an angle to create a chisel edge, or chewed at the end to create a soft brush tip. Different brushes for different jobs, just like today. But here's where the real skill came in, the actual painting. Tomb walls weren't perfectly flat surfaces. They were carved in relief, full of textures and shadows. The painter had to work around these, using colour to enhance the carved forms. They often outlined figures in red or black first, creating definition. Then they'd fill in with flat colours. Egyptian painting wasn't about shading or perspective the way we think of it. It was about symbolic representation and clarity. Figures were painted in what we call the Egyptian style. Heads in profile, eyes shown frontally, shoulders turned to face forward, but legs and feet in profile again. This wasn't because they couldn't paint realistically. Archaeological evidence shows they absolutely could. Instead, this was about showing each body part from its most recognizable angle. It was about clarity and symbolism, not optical accuracy. The painters had to know complex iconography. The color of a figure's skin meant something. Men were usually painted in reddish-brown, representing their outdoor work. Women were painted in lighter, yellowish-white, representing their indoor lives. Gods had their own color rules. Osiris was green, representing rebirth and vegetation. Anubis was black, representing death and the underworld. Get these wrong, and you'd be insulting the gods themselves. Hieroglyphs had to be painted in specific colors too, and they had to be perfectly shaped. Remember, these weren't just decorations. They were magical spells and prayers that would help the deceased in the afterlife. A mistake could potentially damn someone's eternal soul, or at least that was the belief. No pressure, right? Some painters specialized in certain tasks. There were outline draftsmen who did the initial sketches. There were colorists who filled in the flat areas. There were detail specialists who added the tiny touches, the jewelry, the patterns on clothing, the individual feathers on bird wings. And there were senior artists who checked everything, making sure it met the standards and fixed any errors. Working conditions were tough. Tombs carved deep into rock were dark, so they worked by the light of oil lamps, probably fueled by sesame or linseed oil. These lamps gave off smoke and fumes. Combined with the paint fumes and the dust still lingering from the carving phase, the air quality would have been terrible. Many of these artisans probably suffered from respiratory problems. Analysis of mummies from Deir el-Medina shows evidence of lung damage consistent with long-term exposure to dust and fumes. The painters also often applied a final varnish to protect their work and make colours more vibrant. This was probably a resin, possibly acacia or pistacia, dissolved in oil or fat. It gave the paintings a slightly glossy finish and helped protect them from moisture and insects. Now we need to talk about the other artisans, the ones who worked with different materials but were just as essential to creating Egypt's masterpieces. Let's start with the carpenters, because wood was actually kind of scarce in Egypt. The native trees, like acacia, sycamore fig, and tamarisk, were relatively small, and their wood was often twisted or weak. For large, high-quality timber, they had to import it, usually cedar from Lebanon, ebony from Africa, or other exotic woods. This made carpentry a prestigious craft. A master carpenter, working with imported cedar, was doing expensive work that only the wealthy could afford. But carpenters worked at all levels of society. They made everything from simple stools and storage boxes for ordinary people to elaborate furniture for tombs and palaces. The tools of Egyptian carpenters were surprisingly sophisticated. They had bronze saws for cutting wood, though these were pull saws, not push saws like modern Western saws. The blade cut on the pull stroke, which actually gives you more control. They had various types of chisels for carving details and cutting joints. They had mallets for driving the chisels. They had adzes, which are like axes but with the blade perpendicular to the handle, perfect for shaping and smoothing wood. For making holes, they used bow drills. This was a drill bit attached to a shaft, with a bowstring wrapped around the shaft. You'd move the bow back and forth and the drill would spin, cutting into the wood. With different bits, you could make different sized holes with remarkable precision. They also had levels and squares for ensuring their work was straight and true. Egyptian joinery was incredibly advanced. They understood and used mortise and tenon joints, where a projection from one piece of wood fits into a hole in another. They used dovetail joints, where interlocking wedge-shaped cuts hold pieces together. They used dowels, wooden pegs that fit into holes to connect pieces. Some furniture from tombs shows joints so well made that they're still tight after more than 3,000 years. And they could do fancy work too. Veneer, for instance, where a thin layer of expensive wood is glued over a base of cheaper wood, making it look like the whole piece is made from the precious material. They could inlay wood with ivory, ebony, or even gold. They could create marquetry, patterns made from different coloured woods fitted together. Think about making a chair for a pharaoh. The frame might be cedar, carved with protective symbols, and then gilded with gold leaf. The seat might be woven from plant fibres or leather strips. The back might have an ivory inlay showing the pharaoh's name in hieroglyphs. Every joint has to be perfect because this chair needs to support weight and last for eternity in a tomb. If it falls apart, that's a failure that could affect the pharaoh's afterlife. Or consider making a sarcophagus, but a wooden one instead of stone. Some pharaohs had nested sarcophagi, one inside the other, made from wood and covered in gold leaf, and inlaid with semi-precious stones. The most famous is probably Tutankhamun's innermost coffin, which is actually solid gold, but his outer coffins were gilded wood. Creating the base form in wood required incredible carpentry skill, and then goldsmiths and inlay artists would add their touches. Let's move on to the potters, because while pottery might seem less glamorous than gold and jewels, it was absolutely essential to daily life and also had its own artistry. Pottery was used for everything: storage jars for grain, wine, oil, and beer, cooking pots, plates and bowls, even coffins and canopic jars for holding organs during mummification. Early Egyptian pottery was made by hand, using the coiling technique. You'd roll out long ropes of clay, then coil them up in a spiral, gradually building up the walls of your pot. As you built, you'd smooth and thin the walls, shaping them with your hands and simple tools. This was slow, but allowed for a lot of creativity in shapes and sizes. Later, Egyptians started using the potter's wheel, probably introduced from Mesopotamia. This revolutionized pottery making. You'd place a lump of clay on a spinning wheel and use your hands to shape it as it spun. With practice, you could create symmetric, thin-walled vessels much faster than with coiling. But it took real skill to master. Too much pressure and the pot would collapse. Too little and the walls would be thick and uneven. You had to keep the clay wet enough to be workable, but not so wet it got sloppy. Once shaped, pots had to dry slowly to prevent cracking. Then came firing, which transformed soft clay into hard ceramic. Early firings were done in open pits, where pots were stacked and surrounded by fuel. This gave fairly low temperatures and uneven results. Later, they developed kilns, enclosed structures that could reach higher, more controlled temperatures. Egyptian kilns were updraft kilns. The fire was at the bottom, separated from the pottery by a gridded floor. Hot gases would rise through the grid and heat the pots stacked above. By controlling the fuel and airflow, potters could reach temperatures around 1,550 to 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to fully fire their pottery. But pottery wasn't just functional. Decorating pottery was its own art form. In different periods, different styles were popular. Some pottery was painted before firing with mineral pigments that would become permanent during the firing. Others were left plain but polished to a smooth finish. Some periods favoured elaborate painted designs in multiple colours. Others preferred simple elegance. There was also faience, which is technically not pottery but a glazed ceramic material the Egyptians invented. Faience was made from crushed quartz or sand, mixed with a small amount of clay and a glaze material, usually containing copper compounds. When fired, the glaze would turn a brilliant blue or green. Faience was used for jewellery, amulets, decorative tiles, and small objects. It was cheaper than precious stones, but could be almost as beautiful. And then there's the weavers, primarily women, who turned flax fibres into linen cloth. Linen was the fabric of ancient Egypt. It was used for everything from simple loincloths to elaborate pleated robes for the wealthy, from household items like towels and sheets to mummy wrappings for the dead. Creating linen was a long, labour-intensive process. It started with growing flax, a plant with blue flowers that's been cultivated for thousands of years. When the flax was ready, it was pulled up by the roots, not cut. The whole plant was needed. Then came retting, where the flax was soaked in water for days or even weeks. This would rot away the soft tissues, leaving the strong fibres. After retting, the flax was dried and then beaten to separate the fibres. These fibres were then combed to remove short bits and align the long ones. Now you had raw flax fibre, but it still needed to be spun into thread. Spinning was almost always done by women, often working in groups. They'd use a spindle, a weighted stick that would spin as they drew out the fibres, twisting them into thread. A skilled spinner could create thread so fine it was almost like spider silk. The finest Egyptian linen was so sheer you could see through it, reserved for the robes of pharaohs and high priests. Once you had thread, it had to be woven into cloth. Weaving was done on looms, and Egyptian looms were usually horizontal, set up near the ground. The weaver would sit or crouch by the loom, passing the weft thread back and forth through the warp threads. For plain linen, this was straightforward, but time-consuming. For fancy cloth with patterns or different textures, it required careful planning and execution. Some weavers specialized in certain products. There were those who made simple, sturdy cloth for everyday use. There were specialists who created the fine, pleated garments favoured by the elite. There were others who made the huge amounts of linen needed for wrapping mummies, sometimes requiring hundreds of yards of cloth for a single burial. Weaving workshops could be quite large, especially those attached to temples or palaces. Archaeological evidence shows some workshops with multiple looms operating simultaneously, with hierarchies of workers from apprentices to master weavers. These workshops had to meet quotas, producing specific amounts of cloth for royal projects or temple use. There were also leather workers who processed animal hides into leather for sandals, bags, parts of chariots, shield covers, and even some clothing. The tanning process was smelly and unpleasant, involving soaking hides in various solutions, sometimes including animal brains or urine, to preserve them and make them supple. But a skilled leather worker could create items that were both functional and beautiful, sometimes tooled with decorative patterns or dyed in colours. Jewellers worked with materials beyond gold and silver. They cut and polished semi-precious stones, carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, amethyst, obsidian. Each stone had its own properties and required different techniques. Carnelian, for instance, is pretty hard and needs patient grinding and polishing to bring out its translucent orange-red glow. Lapis lazuli, imported from faraway Afghanistan, was so prized that only the wealthiest could afford it. Its deep blue colour, with golden pyrite flecks, was associated with the night sky and the gods. Cutting and shaping these stones without modern tools was incredibly difficult. Jewellers would use harder stones to grind softer ones, working with abrasive powders and water, slowly wearing away material until the piece had the right shape and size. Then came polishing, again with increasingly fine abrasives, until the stone shone. A single bead might take hours or days to perfect. These beads would then be drilled with tiny holes for stringing. The drilling was done with bow drills using hollow reeds or copper tubes with abrasive powder. You had to drill straight, with consistent pressure, or the hole would come out crooked or the stone would crack. For a necklace with hundreds of beads, all carefully graduated in size and perfectly polished, you're looking at weeks or months of work. Then there were the glass makers, working with a material that was relatively new to Egypt during the New Kingdom. Glass making requires high temperatures to melt sand and other materials together. Egyptian glass was usually opaque and brightly coloured, created by adding various metal oxides. Cobalt made blue glass, copper made turquoise or green, manganese made purple. This glass was formed into beads, inlays, and small vessels. One technique that Egyptian glassmakers mastered was core forming. They'd create a core of clay and dung in the shape of the interior of a vessel. Then they'd dip this core into molten glass or wind threads of hot glass around it. While the glass was still soft, they could add decorative trails of different coloured glass, then drag a tool through them to create feathered patterns. Once the glass cooled, they'd scrape out the core, leaving a hollow glass vessel. These were used for precious oils and cosmetics. Now, all of these different craftspeople, from goldsmiths to glassmakers, from stone carvers to weavers, they didn't work in isolation. Large projects, like building and equipping a royal tomb, required coordination between dozens of different specialists. Someone had to organize this, manage workflows, ensure materials were available, and maintain quality standards. This is where administrators and foremen came in. These were often former craftsmen themselves, people who'd proven their skill and reliability. They'd oversee teams of workers, distribute assignments, check work quality, and report to higher officials. Surviving records from Deir el-Medina show detailed administrative documents tracking everything from tool distribution to ration deliveries to work progress. Some of these records are fascinatingly detailed. They note which teams worked on which sections of a tomb, what materials they used, how long tasks took. They record disputes between workers, complaints about unfair treatment, requests for time off. One record mentions a worker who argued he should get more rations because he was working in a particularly difficult section of a tomb. Another records a dispute over the quality of tools provided. These documents also show us that workers were organized into crews, maybe 10 to 20 people, each with a foreman. Crews would often specialize. One crew might be the stone cutters, roughing out chambers and corridors. Another would be the fine carvers, adding reliefs and hieroglyphs. Another would be plasterers, preparing surfaces for painting. And finally, the painters would come in to add colour. Each crew depended on the others, and timing had to be coordinated. Quality control was serious business. For royal work, supervisors would inspect every stage. Hieroglyphs had to be spelled correctly and formed properly. Proportions had to meet standards. Colours had to be right. If work didn't meet standards, it would have to be redone. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about religious correctness. These tombs and temples were meant to serve the deceased and the gods for eternity. Mistakes weren't acceptable. Some artisans became famous, or at least well known, during their lifetimes. We know names of master craftsmen from inscriptions and records. There's Senegem, a worker from Deir el-Medina whose beautifully painted tomb has survived in excellent condition. There's Ka, an architect and supervisor, whose tomb contained an amazing array of everyday objects, giving us incredible insight into daily life. These weren't anonymous masses, they were individuals with names, families, and legacies. Training for these crafts usually began young. Boys would apprentice with their fathers or other family members, learning skills through hands-on practice. A boy apprenticed to a goldsmith might spend years just learning to hammer gold sheets evenly before moving on to more complex techniques. A young stone carver might spend months just learning how to hold a chisel properly, how to strike it at the right angle, how to read the stone to know where it would split or chip. This training was mostly informal, passed down through demonstration and practice rather than formal schooling. But it was thorough. By the time an apprentice became a full craftsman, he'd have years of experience and a deep understanding of his materials and techniques. The best would eventually become masters themselves, training the next generation. Women's roles in craft production varied. They dominated certain fields like weaving, and likely did a lot of spinning and textile work. Some evidence suggests women also worked in brewing, baking, and food preparation on a professional level. But most of the prestige crafts, like stone carving and goldsmithing, seem to have been male-dominated, though there are hints that some women may have worked as painters or in decorative arts. Family workshops were common. A goldsmith might work with his sons and brothers, maybe employing a few other skilled workers. They'd take commissions from wealthy clients, create items for trade, and gradually build a reputation. The best might eventually get royal commissions, working on projects for the pharaoh or major temples. This was the peak of success for a craftsman. But even those who never worked on royal projects could take pride in their work. A carpenter who made a beautiful chair, a potter whose vessels were known for never cracking, a weaver whose cloth was the softest in the market. These artisans had their own forms of success and recognition within their communities. Life wasn't easy for these craftsmen. The work was physically demanding. Stone carvers dealt with heavy tools, constant pounding, clouds of dust. Metal workers dealt with intense heat from furnaces and the dangers of molten metal. Painters inhaled toxic fumes from pigments. Everyone dealt with the Egyptian heat, especially those working in enclosed tombs and workshops. Injuries were common. Archaeological examination of skeletons from Deir el-Medina and other worker sites shows evidence of broken bones, arthritis, spinal damage from carrying heavy loads. Many workers had dental problems from grit in the bread wearing down their teeth, respiratory diseases from dust and fumes, eye problems from working in dim light. These artisans literally gave their bodies to their craft. Medical care existed, and some medical papyri have survived showing treatments for common ailments. But it was limited compared to modern medicine. A badly broken bone might heal crooked or not at all, ending a craftsman's career. Infections could turn deadly. Respiratory diseases would gradually worsen over years. Many workers probably died younger than they should have, their health compromised by their occupation. But there were compensations. The steady rations meant these workers didn't face the hunger that could afflict farmers in bad years. The community at places like Deir el-Medina was tight-knit, with strong social bonds. Families supported each other through hard times. Religious festivals and days off provided breaks from the routine. And there was genuine pride in the work, in being part of creating something that would last forever. Think about it from their perspective. You're a painter finishing work in a pharaoh's burial chamber. You've spent months down in this tomb, carefully painting every hieroglyph, every figure of every god. Your eyes ache from working in lamplight. Your back hurts from bending over. You've breathed in paint fumes until you can taste them. But now you're done, and you step back to look at the complete chamber. Every wall glows with colour. The hieroglyphs march in perfect rows, spells that will protect and guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. The gods stand in their proper places, their faces serene, their symbols correct. You know this work will outlast you, outlast your children, outlast your civilization. In some way, you've achieved immortality through your craft. This sense of contributing to eternity, of serving the gods and the pharaoh, of creating beauty and meaning that transcends individual life. This had to provide some psychological compensation for the hardships. These weren't slaves forced to labor against their will. These were skilled professionals who'd chosen their crafts or been born into them, and who found meaning in their work despite its difficulties. And the evidence we have suggests many of them enjoyed their work and took pride in it. Those ostraca with doodles and sketches, those aren't the products of people who hated their jobs. Those are people who kept creating even when they didn't have to, because creativity was part of who they were. The care evident in work done for private tombs that wouldn't be inspected by royal officials, shows people maintaining standards because of personal pride, not just external pressure. In the workers' village of the lost Golden City, discovered in 2020, archaeologists found a settlement abandoned in a hurry when Akhenaten moved the capital. The inhabitants left behind tools, pottery, furniture, personal items. It's like a snapshot of daily life, frozen in time. In one house, they found a drawing on a wall, a sun disk representing the god Aten. Someone had painted this in their own home, a personal expression of faith or just decoration. In another area, they found workshops with moulds for making amulets, tools for leatherwork, materials for making jewelry. Even in their homes, people were crafting, creating. There's a preserved fish brushed with gold, bizarre and wonderful, purpose unknown. Was it someone's experiment, a religious offering, a whimsical creation? We'll never know, but it shows someone took the time to gild a fish, and that's delightfully human. Throughout both Deir el-Medina and the Lost Golden City, we see evidence of cottage industry, people supplementing their incomes or just expressing themselves through craft. A man who spent his days carving stone might spend evenings making small wooden items to trade. A woman who wove linen for the state might create especially fine pieces for private sale. These weren't just workers punching a clock. They were craftspeople embedded in an economy and society that valued their skills. The techniques these artisans developed and perfected have influenced craft traditions for thousands of years. The granulation technique used by Egyptian goldsmiths was lost and rediscovered multiple times through history. Egyptian blue, that first synthetic pigment, wasn't successfully replicated until modern times, and we're still not entirely sure of all the exact processes they used. The precision of Egyptian stone carving remains impressive, even by modern standards. When Greek and Roman craftsmen came to Egypt, they learned from Egyptian techniques and incorporated them into their own traditions. When Islamic craftsmen later worked in Egypt, they built on foundations laid thousands of years earlier. Even modern jewelers and stone carvers sometimes study ancient Egyptian methods to understand how certain effects were achieved. But beyond the technical legacy, there's something deeper. These ancient artisans understood something fundamental about craft and quality. They knew that excellence required patience, practice, attention to detail. They knew that materials had properties that needed to be respected and understood. They knew that beautiful things required ugly work, that the glamorous golden mask required months of tedious hammering and fitting and polishing. In our modern world of mass production and instant gratification, There's something valuable in remembering these craftsmen. Every beautiful object you see in a museum, every gleaming golden collar, every perfectly proportioned statue, every brilliantly painted tomb wall represents hundreds or thousands of hours of human effort. It represents someone's expertise, patience, and dedication. That goldsmith who spent 3 months creating a single pectoral, adjusting each tiny piece of stone until it fit perfectly, he probably never imagined we'd still be admiring his work more than 3,000 years later. That stone carver who shaped a sarcophagus, pounding away day after day until his hands were scarred and his lungs were full of dust. He was just doing his job, supporting his family, serving his pharaoh, but his work survived when almost everything else from his life disappeared. We don't know most of their names. We'll never know what they looked like, what their voices sounded like, what jokes they told, what worried them at night. But we have their work, and through their work, we know they existed. We know they were skilled. We know they cared about quality. We know they were capable of creating beauty that transcends time. There's a particular poignancy in those artisan tombs at Deir el-Medina. These workers spent their professional lives creating eternal resting places for pharaohs and nobles. Then they'd spend their free time creating their own tombs, applying the same techniques, painting the same gods and spells, hoping for the same eternal rewards. They believed their craftsmanship had spiritual power, that correctly executed hieroglyphs and images could literally help them in the afterlife. Some of these tombs are magnificent, despite being much smaller than royal tombs. The tomb of AncientEgypt, for instance, has wall paintings that are among the finest examples of Egyptian art. The colours are still vibrant after 3,000 years. The figures are beautifully proportioned and detailed. This wasn't work for a pharaoh. This was a craftsman decorating his own tomb, and he brought the same level of skill and care he brought to royal projects. What does that tell us? It tells us that for these artisans, excellence was intrinsic, not just something they did when important people were watching. It tells us they believed in their craft deeply enough to trust their eternal souls to it. It tells us that even workers of modest means could aspire to beauty and quality in their final resting places. The items found in artisan tombs also reveal their values. Ka's tomb contained tools, including a cubit rod, a measuring tool, writing equipment, and models of workers. These were the things he wanted in the afterlife, the things that defined him, not weapons or symbols of power, but the tools of his trade and the signs of his profession. He was proud to be an artisan. When we look at the grand accomplishments of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the treasures, it's easy to focus on the pharaohs who commissioned them or the priests who blessed them. But every single piece was made by human hands. Every stone was cut and shaped by someone. Every hieroglyph was carved by someone. Every colour was mixed and applied by someone. These someones were the craftsmen and artisans, the true creators of Egypt's enduring masterpieces. They worked in systems that could be rigid and hierarchical. They faced pressures and expectations. They dealt with difficult materials, harsh conditions, and the ever-present possibility of mistakes that could have serious consequences. But within these constraints, they found room for creativity, for excellence, for personal expression. The diversity of skill levels is also worth noting. Not every artisan was a master. Some work shows hesitation, errors, corrections. Some hieroglyphs are clumsily formed. Some carvings are rougher than others. This is normal and human. Not everyone can be the best, but everyone contributed. The apprentice learning to shape gold, the journeyman carver working on less visible parts of a tomb, the weaver creating simple cloth for daily use. They were all part of the system that created ancient Egypt's material culture. And the system worked. It worked for thousands of years across multiple dynasties. It survived changes in religion, shifts in political power, foreign invasions, internal rebellions. Through it all, the craft traditions continued. Sons learned from fathers. Apprentices became masters. New workers replaced those who aged out or died. The knowledge passed down, adapted, evolved, but maintained its core excellence. This stability allowed for incredible achievements. You can't create a gold pectoral with hundreds of inlaid pieces without decades of accumulated knowledge. You can't carve a perfectly smooth granite sarcophagus without generations of stone carvers refining their techniques. You can't paint hieroglyphs that will last 3,000 years without a deep understanding of materials and methods that took centuries to develop. But stability also had costs. Innovation could be limited. Techniques that worked were repeated rather than questioned. There was probably resistance to change, to new methods that might be better but were unproven. The system valued consistency and reliability, which could sometimes stifle creativity. Still, innovation did happen. Egyptian blue was invented at some point by someone experimenting with materials. New tools were developed. Techniques improved. But these changes happened gradually, tested thoroughly before being widely adopted. In a system where mistakes could have religious consequences, where pharaohs expected perfection, caution made sense. The craftsmen themselves existed in a specific social position, above peasants and labourers, but below nobles and priests. They were respectable, skilled, valued, but they weren't powerful in political terms. They served the system, they didn't control it. Their status came from their skills, not their wealth or connections. Those successful craftsmen could accumulate some wealth and certainly passed on valuable skills to their children. This middle position probably gave them a unique perspective on Egyptian society. They worked closely with nobles and priests, creating items for them, entering their homes and tombs. But they also lived among common people, understood their struggles and joys. They bridged different worlds in a society that was otherwise quite stratified. In the archaeological record, we can see this bridge. High-status tombs have the finest work by the best artisans. Middle-status tombs, like those of the artisans themselves, have excellent work but on a smaller scale with less expensive materials. Lower status burials have simpler items, but they still often include crafted objects, pottery and simple jewellery, showing that even ordinary people had access to craft goods, if only basic ones. This tells us craft was integrated throughout society, not just reserved for the elite. Yes, the best craftsmen worked on royal projects. Yes, the finest materials went to the wealthiest patrons. But pottery, textiles, simple furniture, these were available to nearly everyone. The skills and knowledge of the craft community served the entire society. The religious aspect of craft work can't be overstated. Many craftsmen saw themselves as serving the gods through their work. Creating items for temples and tombs wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty. The god Ptah was patron of craftsmen, and workers would pray to him for skill and success. Getting the hieroglyphs right, depicting gods properly, using correct symbols and colours, all of this had spiritual significance. Some evidence suggests craftsmen underwent purification before certain types of work, especially when creating cult statues or other highly sacred items. They might fast, bathe ritually, wear specific clothes. This transformed the work from mere manufacture into a religious act. The object being created wasn't just a thing, it was a vessel for divine power. This belief probably helped maintain quality standards. If you believe a mistake in carving a god's image might bring divine punishment, you're going to be very careful. If you think correctly executed hieroglyphs have actual magical power, you're going to make sure they're perfect. Religion and craft were intertwined in ways that reinforced excellence. The craftsmen also created items for their own religious use. Amulets for protection, small statues of favoured gods, votive offerings. These personal religious objects show their beliefs and priorities. Popular gods among craftsmen included Ptah, as mentioned, but also Bez, a dwarf god who protected households, and Tauret, a hippopotamus goddess associated with childbirth and home life. These were practical, protective deities, not the grand state gods like Ra or Amun. In their homes and personal chapels, craftsmen could express their spirituality more freely than in their professional work. While royal tombs had to follow strict rules about which gods appeared where and how they were depicted, a craftsman's personal shrine could be more eclectic, including favourite deities regardless of their official importance. Letters to the dead, written on ostraka or pottery bowls, and left at tombs, show people asking deceased relatives for help with problems. Some of these letters were written by craftsmen, asking for assistance with work problems, health issues, family disputes. These show a worldview where the dead remained active participants in the lives of the living, where communication across the boundary of death was possible and normal. This connection between the living and the dead makes the work of tomb craftsmen even more significant. They were literally creating the eternal homes where the dead would continue to exist. The comfort, safety, and success of the deceased in the afterlife depended partly on how well the craftsmen did their jobs. That's a heavy responsibility, but also a meaningful one. Your work wasn't just for the living, it was for eternity. As we wrap up this journey through the world of ancient Egyptian craftsmen, let's return to where we started. The question of who actually made all these incredible things. The answer is now clear. They were made by people. People with names, families, hopes, problems, people who got hungover and missed work, people who mourned their dead and prayed to their gods, people who took pride in their skills and passed them down to their children. They worked with basic tools that seem primitive to us but were sophisticated for their time. They developed techniques that we still don't fully understand. They created objects of such beauty and quality that they continue to amaze us thousands of years later. They did this not through magic or alien intervention, but through skill, patience, knowledge, and dedication. The next time you see a photograph of an Egyptian artifact, a golden mask or a painted tomb wall or a perfect stone statue, remember the hands that made it. Remember the goldsmith hunched over his work, carefully fitting tiny pieces of stone into gold cloisons. Remember the stone carver, covered in dust, pounding away day after day. Remember the painter, mixing pigments in the flickering lamplight, carefully applying each colour according to ancient rules. Remember the carpenter shaping wood with his adze, the weaver passing threads through her loom, the potter centering clay on a wheel. Remember the apprentices learning, the journeymen practicing, the masters teaching. Remember the foreman organising, the administrators recording, the community supporting. These were the real creators of ancient Egypt's enduring masterpieces. Not the pharaohs whose names are in the headlines, but the anonymous artisans whose names are mostly lost. They worked in systems that could be rigid and demanding. They faced conditions that were often harsh and unhealthy, but they created beauty, meaning, and quality that has lasted through the millennia. Their legacy isn't just the objects they made, though those are incredible. Their legacy is also the proof that humans are capable of extraordinary things when they commit to excellence, when they learn deeply, when they care about their work. In an age of disposable goods and planned obsolescence, there's something powerful about work intended to last forever and actually succeeding. These craftsmen believed in permanence, in getting things right, in work that mattered. They believed their skills had value, that what they created had meaning beyond its immediate use. They believed in beauty, in precision, in doing difficult things well, and they were right. Here we are, thousands of years later, still learning from them, still inspired by them, still amazed by what they accomplished. So, when you visit a museum and see Egyptian artifacts, you're not just seeing old stuff. You're seeing the work of specific individuals who lived full lives in a different time. You're seeing the result of someone's expertise, someone's patience, someone's dedication to their craft. You're seeing proof that excellence is timeless, that skill and care create things that endure. And maybe, just maybe, that can inspire us in our own work, whatever it might be. We might not be hammering gold or carving granite, but we can still bring that same dedication to excellence, that same care for quality, that same pride in doing things well. The artisans of ancient Egypt left us more than beautiful objects. They left us an example of what humans can achieve when they commit fully to their craft, and that lesson is as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago in the hot workshops along the Nile. But let's dig even deeper into specific aspects of their lives, because the more we understand about these craftsmen, the more human they become, and the more we can appreciate their achievements. Let's talk about a day in the life of different artisans, starting with perhaps the most physically demanding, the stone workers in the Valley of the Kings. Imagine you're a stone cutter named Kamwaset. You're 35 years old, which is actually pretty old for this line of work. You've been cutting stone since you were 12. Learning from your father who learned from his father. You wake up in your small house in Deir el-Medina before dawn because the work starts early, before the desert sun makes the Valley of the Kings unbearable. Your wife has already prepared a breakfast of bread and beer. The bread is grainy, and you can feel it wearing down your teeth with every bite, but it's filling, and you'll need the energy. The beer is thick and nutritious, not like the watery stuff some brewers try to pass off. You eat quickly because the foreman doesn't tolerate lateness. You gather your tools, your bronze chisel, carefully sharpened yesterday evening, your wooden mallet, and your basket for carrying away stone chips. These tools are provided by the state, but you're responsible for maintaining them. Lose a chisel or break it through carelessness, and you'll have to explain yourself to the administrators, and they'll probably dock your rations. The walk to the Valley of the Kings takes about 40 minutes through the desert hills. You travel with your crew, maybe 15 other men, all stone workers. The conversation is the same as always. Complaints about rations being late last week, gossip about someone's daughter getting married, speculation about how much longer this particular tomb will take. The foreman walks ahead, already mentally planning the day's work. When you arrive at the tomb, you descend into darkness. This tomb has been under construction for 3 years now, and it's already penetrated deep into the hillside. The first chambers are complete, walls smooth and ready for the carvers who'll add the hieroglyphs. But your crew is working on extending the corridor deeper, cutting into fresh rock. Oil lamps provide the only light, their flames flickering and smoking. The air is already thick with dust from yesterday's work and the smoke from the lamps. You tie a cloth around your nose and mouth, but it doesn't help much. After a few hours, your lungs will be full of grit anyway. Your job today is the same as yesterday and the day before, removing stone. You and another worker take turns. One holds the chisel against the rock face, while the other swings the mallet. It's rhythmic work. Position the chisel, strike, move the chisel, strike again. The ringing of metal on stone echoes in the confined space, mixing with the sounds of a dozen other teams doing the same work. Every few minutes, you switch positions, because swinging the mallet is exhausting, and holding the chisel leaves your hands numb from the vibration. The stone comes away in chunks and chips that you sweep into baskets. Young boys, apprentices, and sons of workers carry these baskets out of the tomb and dump them in designated areas outside. After 4 hours, there's a break. You climb out of the tomb into the daylight, and even though the sun is blazing, the fresh air feels incredible. You drink water from the jars that have been brought from the village, eat a simple meal of bread and onions. Your hands are cramping, your shoulders ache, and the ringing in your ears from the constant hammering won't stop. But this is normal. This is the job. During the break, the foreman comes around to inspect progress. He's pleased with your crew's work, You've advanced the corridor by almost a cubit, which is good progress in this hard stone. He makes a note on his ostracon, recording the team's performance. Good reports mean your rations stay steady. Bad reports could mean reductions. After the break, it's back into the tomb for another 4-hour shift. By the time you're done for the day, every muscle aches. The dust in your lungs makes you cough. Your hands are blistered despite the calluses built up over 23 years of this work. But you've done your job, and done it well. The walk back to the village is quieter than the morning walk. Everyone is tired, but there's also a sense of satisfaction. The tomb is progressing. In a few years, when it's complete and a pharaoh is buried there, you'll have been part of making that happen. Your work, quite literally, supports the eternal life of a god king. That means something. Back home, you clean up as best you can, scrubbing the worst of the dust off in a basin of water. Your wife has prepared dinner, a stew with vegetables and a bit of dried fish. After eating, you sit outside your door in the evening cool, talking with neighbours. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, but in 2 days it's your rest day. Maybe you'll work on your own tomb, adding some carvings to the entrance. Or maybe you'll just rest. Your back has been bothering you more lately. Now let's shift to a completely different experience. Imagine you're Nefertari, a weaver. Yes, women played crucial roles in ancient Egyptian craft production, even if they don't appear in records as much as men. You're 22 years old, married with 2 children, and you work in a weaving workshop attached to a temple. Your day starts even earlier than Camwasset's because you have children to feed and get settled before you can leave for work. Your mother-in-law, who lives in the house next door, will watch them during the day. This multi-generational arrangement is common and necessary for families where both adults work. You walk to the temple workshop with other women from your neighbourhood. The workshop is a large, open-sided room near the temple complex, designed to catch the morning light and any breeze. Inside are a dozen horizontal looms, and the air is full of the sound of shuttles passing and women's voices. Your loom is always the same one, near the eastern wall where the light is best. You've been weaving since you were 8 years old, taught by your mother, who was taught by her mother. Your hands know the movements without conscious thought. Select the weft thread, pass it through the warp, beat it into place with the reed, again and again and again. Today you're working on linen for temple use, cloth that will be used to dress cult statues and wrap sacred objects. This needs to be fine linen, not the coarse stuff used for everyday purposes. The thread you're working with is incredibly thin, spun by specialists to an exact gauge. Working with such fine thread is challenging because it breaks easily if you pull too hard, but it creates cloth of exceptional quality. The work is repetitive, but requires constant attention. Let your mind wander too much, and you'll make a mistake, get the thread count wrong, or create an uneven section that will have to be redone. The overseers check the work regularly, and they have exacting standards. Poor quality cloth won't be accepted, and if you produce too much substandard work, you might be assigned to making coarser cloth which pays less. But repetitive doesn't mean boring. You work alongside the same women every day, and you talk constantly. Gossip about neighbours, discussions about children, advice on dealing with difficult husbands, recipes and remedies. Someone's daughter is getting married next month, and there's much speculation about the bride price. Someone else is pregnant again and feeling sick. One of the older women is having trouble with her hands cramping and is worried she won't be able to keep working much longer. The work rhythm is broken by meal breaks. At midday, you stop to eat bread, cheese, and fruit, drinking beer that the temple provides. Your hands ache from the constant motion, so you massage them and stretch your fingers. Some of the older women have fingers twisted from years of this work, arthritis setting in early. You hope that doesn't happen to you, but you've already noticed some stiffness in your hands on cold mornings. The quality of the linen you produce is a source of pride. Last month, one of the priests complimented the workshop on the evenness of a batch of cloth you'd worked on. That kind of recognition feels good. Acknowledgement that your skill matters. You're not just making cloth, you're contributing to the service of the gods. But there's also practical pride. You know that the cloth you make is among the finest in Egypt. People from other regions know that linen from your temple workshops is superior. Merchants seek it out. Foreign dignitaries receive it as gifts and are impressed. Your hands and the hands of the women working beside you create something of recognized value. By the end of the day, you've woven several cubits of cloth. Your back is sore from bending over the loom, and your eyes are tired from focusing on the fine threads. But there's satisfaction in seeing the cloth grow, in knowing tomorrow you'll continue and next week a piece of cloth you wove will be clothing a god statue in the temple sanctuary. You collect your ration payment, grain, a bit of oil, some beer, and head home. The children are energetic and demanding, requiring food and attention. You prepare the evening meal, help your eldest with a task her teacher assigned to nurse the younger one. After they're finally asleep, you have a little time to yourself. You work on a special piece of linen you're weaving for your own family, incorporating a decorative border pattern your mother taught you. This is for you, not for temple or trade, and that makes it feel different, more personal. Now let's jump to someone with a very different skill set. You're Amenhotep, a painter of hieroglyphs and sacred images. You're 40 years old and at the peak of your abilities. You've been painting in tombs for 25 years, and there's probably no one in the entire workers' village who knows the sacred texts and images better than you do. Your day begins with ritual preparation because today you'll be painting images of gods in a burial chamber, and this requires spiritual purity. You bathe in cold water, put on clean linen clothing, and spend some time in prayer at your household shrine, asking Ptah and Thoth for steady hands and clear vision. You gather your equipment, brushes of different sizes, some made from reeds, others from palm fibers, each suited for different types of work. Your paint pots contain pigments you mixed yesterday: Egyptian blue, yellow ochre, red ochre, black carbon, white gypsum, and malachite green. Each pigment was carefully ground to the right consistency and mixed with gum arabic as a binder. Getting the consistency right is crucial. Too thick and the paint won't flow smoothly. Too thin and the colours will be weak and streaky. The tomb you're working in has already been carved and plastered. The plasterers did their work last month, creating a smooth surface perfect for painting. A sketch artist has already laid out the basic design in red ochre, marking where each figure and hieroglyph should go. Your job is to bring it to life with colour. You start with the hieroglyphs because these are the most important elements. Each glyph is both an image and a symbol, and both aspects must be perfect. You begin with the bird hieroglyphs. There are several in this section because these require the most delicate work. The ibis must have its distinctive curved beak, the falcon its sharp profile, the owl its round face. You work carefully, using a fine brush to outline each glyph in black. Then you'll fill in with colour, green for some, blue for others, yellow, red, each according to ancient rules you've memorized so thoroughly you don't even have to think about them anymore. A glyph painted in the wrong colour isn't just ugly, it's religiously incorrect. It could confuse or even anger the gods. The light is poor in the burial chamber despite the lamps positioned around your work area. You're working deep underground, and the lamplight flickers and casts shadows that can be deceiving. You've learned to compensate, to use the shadows to check your work, to know when the light is too uncertain and you need to stop and trim the lamp wicks. After the hieroglyphs, you move to the figures. Today's section shows Osiris, lord of the underworld, and Anubis, guide of the dead. These are gods you've painted hundreds of times, but each time must be as good as the first. Osiris must be green, the colour of rebirth and vegetation. Anubis must be black, the colour of the rich soil and of death itself. You paint Osiris's skin first, a rich green that you mix from malachite powder. The colour must be even, no streaks or thin spots. You use a medium-sized brush, working in smooth, controlled strokes. Then come the details. The white crown, the golden crook and flail, the intricate collar of beads around his neck. Each element requires a different brush, different colours, careful planning to avoid smudging wet paint. Osiris's face demands special attention. The eye must be perfect, painted in the traditional Egyptian style, with its distinctive shape and lined with black. The expression must be serene but authoritative, eternal and unchanging. You've painted this face so many times you could do it in your sleep, but you never let yourself become complacent. Each face deserves your full concentration. Your back aches from bending over, and your eyes hurt from the close work in dim light. You take breaks, stepping outside to rest your eyes in sunlight, drinking water, eating a bit of bread. During these breaks, you inspect yesterday's work, checking that nothing has smudged or faded, looking for any spots that need touching up. There's a young apprentice working with you today, a boy of maybe 14 whose father was a painter. You're teaching him, though mostly he's watching and doing simple tasks like mixing paints and washing brushes. Occasionally you let him fill in a simple area, a section of solid colour that doesn't require fine control. He's eager but clumsy, and you have to redo some of his work. But that's how learning happens. You were the same way once. You tell the boy stories as you work, explaining the meaning behind the images. Osiris is shown green because he died and was reborn, like crops that grow from seeds planted in the earth. Anubis is black like the fertile soil, but also because he presides over mummification, where bodies are blackened with resin and preservatives. Everything in these paintings has meaning. Color isn't decoration, it's sacred communication. The boy asks questions, sometimes intelligent ones that make you think, sometimes naive ones that show how much he has to learn. You answer patiently, because passing on knowledge is part of your responsibility. When you're old and your hands shake too much to paint fine detail, younger painters will continue the work. You want them to understand not just how to paint, but why. By day's end, you've completed about 2 cubits of painted wall, a section containing multiple god figures and perhaps 50 hieroglyphs. Tomorrow you'll continue, and the day after, gradually working your way around the chamber. In a month, maybe 2, this room will be complete. A sacred space where the deceased will dwell forever, protected and guided by the gods you've painted. You clean your brushes carefully. Good brushes are valuable and hard to replace. You secure your paint pots so nothing spills. You say a quiet prayer of thanks that today's work went well. No major mistakes, no smudged paint, no broken brushes. Walking home in the evening, you think about tomorrow's section. There are some complex hieroglyphs coming up, unusual ones that don't appear in every tomb. You'll need to check your references, maybe look at some of the ostraca at home where you've sketched challenging glyphs for reference. Getting them right matters, not just for your pride, but because these spells will literally help guide the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. Your work has cosmic importance. One more perspective, then we'll step back to look at the broader implications. You're Ptah-hotep, a master goldsmith, and you're working on the most important commission of your life, a pectoral for the great royal wife, the pharaoh's principal queen. This isn't work that gets assigned to just anyone. You're 55 years old, you've been working gold for 43 years, and you're recognized as one of the finest goldsmiths in all of Egypt. The design was provided by the royal court, a winged scarab pushing the sun disk, flanked by protective goddesses, all contained within a framework of protective symbols. The execution, however, is entirely up to you, and this is where your artistry will shine. You've been working on this piece for 4 months now, and you estimate at least another 2 months before it's complete. Your workshop is attached to your house, a privilege earned through years of successful work and growing reputation. The workshop has thick mud brick walls to help control temperature and several small windows positioned to catch the north breeze while minimizing dust. Your workbench is positioned to catch the best light. This morning you're working on the cloisons, the gold wire framework that will hold the inlaid stones. You've already hammered out the backing sheet, a piece of gold about the thickness of a modern credit card, perfectly flat and smooth. Now you're creating the maze of tiny cells that will hold the stones. The gold wire you're using is incredibly thin, perhaps 0.5 millimeter in diameter. You've made it yourself through a painstaking process of hammering and drawing through progressively smaller holes until the wire reached the exact thickness needed. Now you're bending this wire into shapes. The outline of the scarab, the curves of the goddess's wings, the symbols that border the design. The work requires absolute concentration. You heat each piece of wire slightly over a small charcoal brazier to make it more malleable. Too much heat and it melts. Too little and it won't bend smoothly. You shape each piece using small bronze tools, tweezers to hold it, tiny hammers to tap it into place, burnishers to smooth any rough spots. Each shaped piece must fit perfectly against its neighbours. Gaps will ruin the final appearance, allowing light to show through where it shouldn't, making the piece look crude instead of refined. You test fit each piece multiple times, adjusting, trimming, reshaping, until everything locks together precisely. Once you're satisfied with the fit, comes the most nerve-wracking part: soldering. You need to attach these wire cloisons to the backing sheet permanently. The solder is a mixture of gold with a lower melting point than the pieces you're joining. You apply tiny amounts of solder at each joint, then heat the whole assembly carefully, watching the solder flow and bond the pieces together. This is where decades of experience matter. Too much heat, and you'll melt the delicate wires you've spent days creating. Too little, and the solder won't flow properly, leaving weak joints that could fail later. The temperature has to be just right, and you can only judge that through experience, watching the color of the metal as it heats, knowing exactly when to apply and remove heat. Your heart pounds every time you do this, because one mistake could destroy weeks of work. But your hands are steady, your judgment is sound, and when you finally douse the piece in water and inspect it, the joints are perfect. The cloisons are now permanently attached, creating a network of gold cells ready to receive the stones. But that's next month's work. Right now, you turn your attention to the stones themselves. The royal treasury has provided materials: carnelian, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and some obsidian. These are already cut into rough shapes, but they need to be fitted precisely to the cloisons. You start with a piece of carnelian destined for part of the sun disk. You hold the stone against the cell it will fill, checking the fit. It's close, but not perfect. You'll need to grind it down slightly. Using increasingly fine abrasive powders on a flat stone surface, you carefully remove material from the carnelian. Test, grind, test, grind. It's tedious work that can't be rushed. After perhaps 2 hours of patient grinding, the carnelian drops into its cell and sits perfectly, level with the surrounding gold. No gaps. One piece done. There are perhaps 200 more pieces to fit. You'll work on a few each day, mixing this work with other tasks to avoid the tedium becoming too oppressive. Your eldest son, who's 28 and already a skilled goldsmith himself, works at the other end of the bench on a simpler commission, a bracelet for a noble's daughter. You supervise his work during breaks from your own, offering advice, pointing out areas that could be improved. He's good, perhaps better than you were at his age, and you feel pride in that. When you can no longer do this work, he'll maintain the family reputation. Around midday, a scribe from the royal palace arrives to check on progress. This happens every couple of weeks with such an important commission. You show him what's been completed, explain the next steps, estimate the timeline for completion. He makes notes on a papyrus scroll, asks a few questions, then leaves satisfied. The pressure of this oversight is constant, but you've learned to live with it. Important work brings important scrutiny. In the afternoon, you teach your younger apprentice, a boy of 16 who's not related to your family but whose father paid you to train him. He's working on simple wire twisting, learning to create decorative patterns. His work is crude but improving. You remember being that young, struggling with these same basic skills, wondering if you'd ever be any good at this. The memory makes you patient with his mistakes. By evening, you've made good progress on several carnelian pieces and completed the attachment of cloisons for one section of the design. Your eyes are tired from the close work, your back aches from bending over the bench, but there's deep satisfaction in what you've accomplished. This pectoral, when complete, will be worn by one of the most powerful women in Egypt. It will probably be buried with her eventually, placed on her mummy as she journeys to the afterlife. Your work will last forever, will serve divine purposes. How many craftsmen in the world can say that about what they do? These individual stories, these glimpses into specific lives, they show us something crucial. These weren't just anonymous labourers. These were skilled professionals with expertise, pride, families, hopes, fears. They were people as complex as we are, living in a different time and place but fundamentally human in their experiences. The archaeological evidence supports these reconstructions. The ostraka from Deir el-Medina give us attendance records, ration distributions, personal letters. The tombs themselves show us the tools, techniques, and results. Skeletal remains show us the physical toll the work took on bodies. Together, these sources let us recreate their lives with surprising detail. One thing that emerges clearly from this evidence is the importance of knowledge transfer, of the master-apprentice relationship. Crafts weren't learned from books or formal schools, but through hands-on experience under expert guidance. This system had strengths and weaknesses. The strength was that apprentices learned not just techniques but all the subtle details that make the difference between adequate work and excellence. They learned how gold feels when it's at the right temperature, how stone sounds when you're cutting it correctly, how paint flows when it's mixed properly. These are things that can't really be taught from books or lectures. You have to experience them. The weakness was that knowledge was siloed within craft families and communities. If a particular technique was known to one family and they didn't share it or died out, that technique could be lost. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record, where certain sophisticated techniques appear, disappear, and sometimes reappear much later, suggesting they were lost and had to be rediscovered. Another important aspect is the integration of craft knowledge with religious belief. These craftsmen weren't just technically skilled. They were deeply religious people who saw their work as having spiritual significance. This probably helped maintain quality standards and gave meaning to difficult, demanding work. But it also meant that innovation was always framed within religious context. You couldn't just change things because they might work better. You had to consider whether changes would be religiously acceptable. The social organization of craft work is also fascinating. Different crafts had different levels of prestige. Working with precious materials like gold generally carried more status than working with common materials like clay, even though both required skill. Work for the state, especially for royal and temple projects, was more prestigious than work for private clients. Master craftsmen who supervised others had higher status than individual workers. But status was complicated and context-dependent. A master potter who created exceptional work might be more respected in his community than a mediocre goldsmith. A stone carver who could achieve effects others couldn't might be sought after despite stone carving being grueling physical labor. Skill and reputation mattered, not just what material you worked with. The economic organization was equally complex. Some craftsmen were state employees, receiving regular rations as payment, like those at Deir el-Medina. Others worked in temple workshops with similar arrangements. But there were also independent craftsmen who worked for private clients on commission, receiving payment in goods or barter, and many craftsmen probably did a mix, some state work and some private commissions. This economic diversity meant craftsmen had to be more than just technically skilled. They had to understand value, negotiate deals, manage client relationships. The master goldsmith making a pectoral for the queen needed different skills than one making jewelry for sale in the market, even though the technical goldsmithing might be similar. One involved navigating royal bureaucracy and meeting exacting standards under pressure. The other involved assessing what customers wanted and could afford, delivering goods that would sell. The role of women in craft production deserves more attention than it often gets. While men dominated certain prestige crafts, women were essential in others. Textile production was overwhelmingly women's work, and textiles were crucial to the economy. Every piece of clothing, every burial wrapping, every sail for boats came from looms, worked primarily by women. Women also probably dominated food production crafts like brewing and baking at a professional level, though they're less visible in the record. Brewing in particular was important because beer was a staple food and form of payment. A skilled brewer producing consistent, quality beer was providing essential value. Some evidence suggests women also worked in certain types of jewelry making, possibly specializing in beadwork and stringing. The creation of elaborate collar necklaces with thousands of tiny beads would have been incredibly tedious work, possibly assigned to women whose hands were considered more suited to such delicate, patient tasks. The families of craftsmen were also important. Children helped from young ages, running errands, cleaning workshops, preparing materials. This was part of their education, learning the rhythms and requirements of craft work before they began serious training. Wives managed households, which in many cases included workshops, balancing domestic duties with craft-related tasks. In this integrated family workshop model, The line between home and work was blurry. The house might include workshop space. Family meals might be interrupted by client visits. Children would fall asleep to the sounds of their father hammering metal or their mother's loom. This complete integration of work and life shaped the experience of growing up in craft families. The village itself functioned as an extended craft community. Neighbours were colleagues, social events were networking opportunities. Marriages often linked craft families, creating alliances and knowledge-sharing arrangements. A goldsmith's daughter marrying a stone carver's son wasn't just a family matter. It was a connection between craft specialties that might lead to collaborative opportunities. Religious festivals provided breaks from work routine, but also reinforced community bonds. The villagers would participate together in processions, feasts, and ceremonies. These shared religious experiences, combined with their shared work experience, created strong community identity. They weren't just people who happened to live near each other. They were a community of craftsmen bound by common work, common beliefs, and common interests. Tensions existed too, of course. Records mention disputes over rations, accusations of theft, conflicts over work assignments. Some people were more respected than others. Some were considered difficult to work with. Just like any human community, there were personalities that clashed and grudges that simmered. But the remarkable thing is how well the system worked overall, for centuries. Despite the tensions and occasional disputes, the work continued. The tombs got built. The quality remained high. The social organization, the technical training, the religious motivation, and the practical compensation combined to create a system that functioned effectively over very long time periods. When we think about sustainability in modern work contexts, there are lessons here. The ancient Egyptian craft system was sustainable for centuries because it balanced multiple factors: economic compensation, adequate for workers to live reasonably, meaningful work that served purposes beyond mere commerce, training systems that effectively passed knowledge to new generations, and community support structures that helped people through difficult times. Modern work often lacks these elements. Jobs may pay adequately but feel meaningless, or they may be meaningful but pay poorly. Training is often inadequate, expecting workers to be productive without proper knowledge transfer. Community support is minimal, with people expected to function as isolated individuals rather than parts of mutually supportive networks. The ancient Egyptian craftsmen show us that sustainable, high-quality work requires more than just technique and compensation. It requires meaning, community, tradition, and integration of work into a larger life purpose. These craftsmen endured harsh conditions and physical hardship partly because their work mattered in ways that transcended immediate physical comfort. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize their lives. The work was genuinely hard and dangerous. Many craftsmen suffered health problems from their work. The system was rigid in ways that could be stifling. Most craftsmen had little choice about their profession. They did what their families did and what the state needed. The social stratification meant many talented people probably never had opportunities to develop their abilities because they were born into the wrong circumstances. But within these constraints, People created spaces for excellence, for pride, for meaning. They found ways to express themselves through their work. They developed deep expertise and took satisfaction in wielding that expertise effectively. They created community with others who shared their profession. They raised families and maintained traditions, and believed their work served eternal purposes. And they were right about that last part, in a way they couldn't have imagined. Their work has survived, not just for one lifetime or one generation, but for thousands of years. We remember them, even though we don't know their names. We admire their skill. We study their techniques. We display their work in museums where millions of people marvel at it. That goldsmith who spent 6 months perfecting a pectoral, he's achieved a kind of immortality through his work. That stone carver who shaped a sarcophagus, whose hands were scarred and whose lungs were damaged by his work, he's remembered through the object that survives him. That painter who mixed pigments and carefully painted hieroglyphs in a dark tomb, her work for some painters were probably women, even if records don't often mention them, still glows with colour thousands of years later. They created not just for their own time but for eternity, and they succeeded. In doing so, they left us a legacy that's more than just beautiful objects. They left us evidence of what humans can accomplish, what we can create when we commit deeply to craft and quality. They left us inspiration to care about our own work, to take pride in doing things well, to understand that excellence matters and endures. In our modern world of rapid obsolescence, where products are designed to be replaced rather than to last, where craftsmanship is often undervalued compared to speed and cost-cutting, the ancient Egyptian artisans remind us of different values. They show us that slow, careful, skilled work can create things of genuine, lasting value. They show us that expertise matters, that knowledge and technique developed over years and passed down through generations produce results that can't be achieved any other way. They also remind us that all work has dignity when done well. The tomb of a simple stone carver at Deir el-Medina, decorated with care and skill, shows that even people of modest means could create beauty and aspire to eternal rewards. The ostrakhan doodles, sketches done just for fun or practice, show that creativity exists at all levels, that the impulse to create is fundamentally human and not limited to paid professionals working on important commissions. So as we finish this journey through the world of ancient Egyptian craftsmen and artisans, let's remember the fundamental humanity of these people. They lived in a time we can barely imagine, in conditions we'd find difficult to endure, working with tools that seem primitive to us. But they were people like us, worried about feeding their families, proud of doing their jobs well, annoyed by incompetent co-workers, satisfied by completing a difficult task successfully, hoping to be remembered after death. They succeeded in that last hope in ways they couldn't have imagined. We don't remember them as individuals, mostly, but we remember them collectively. Every time someone visits a museum and marvels at an ancient Egyptian artifact, they're remembering these craftsmen. Every time an archaeologist carefully excavates and studies an object, they're honouring the person who made it. Every time someone tries to understand ancient Egyptian techniques and maybe attempts to recreate them, they're keeping that knowledge alive. The craftsmen of ancient Egypt, from the goldsmith perfecting a pectoral to the stone carver shaping a sarcophagus, from the painter mixing the perfect blue to the weaver creating cloth so fine you could see through it. They were masters of their crafts and creators of enduring masterpieces. They were also fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, neighbours and friends, people who laughed and cried and worried and hoped. They were human, and their humanity shines through in their work, in the care evident in every golden wire carefully placed, every hieroglyph perfectly painted, every stone surface polished to a mirror sheen. They gave us more than beautiful objects. They gave us proof of human capability, evidence of what we can achieve when we commit to excellence. And that gift, unlike the gold and stone and paint they worked with, is truly eternal. It continues to inspire, to challenge, to remind us of the best possibilities of human creativity and skill. And for that, we owe them our remembrance and our gratitude, not as nameless workers from a distant past, but as fellow humans who did extraordinary things and left a legacy that enriches our world thousands of years after their hands fell still. Let's explore even more deeply into specific craft mysteries that scholars are still unraveling today, because understanding how these artisans achieved certain effects helps us appreciate their genius even more. Take Egyptian blue, that mysterious synthetic pigment. Modern scientists have tried to recreate it using ancient techniques, and what they've discovered is both impressive and humbling. The recipe seems simple enough. Mix silica sand, a copper compound like malachite, calcium carbonate like limestone, and a small amount of alkali like natron. Heat this mixture to somewhere between 1470 and 1650 degrees Fahrenheit, and maintain that temperature for several hours. What comes out, if you've done everything right, are brilliant blue crystals that can be ground into a stable pigment that won't fade or change colour over millennia. Simple, right? Except it's not simple at all. The proportions have to be almost exact. Too much copper and you get green instead of blue. Too little and the colour is weak. The temperature has to be maintained within a fairly narrow range for hours. Get it too hot and you ruin the batch. Too cool and the chemical reactions don't happen properly. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen achieved this consistency without thermometers, without precise scales, without modern kilns with temperature controls. How did they do it? They used their senses and their experience. They learned to judge temperature by the colour of the fire, by how the air shimmered above the kiln, by subtle signs we've mostly forgotten how to read. They learned the right proportions through trial and error, probably over generations, until master craftsmen could mix the ingredients by eye and hand, knowing what the mixture should look like and feel like when it was right. This kind of knowledge isn't just technical, it's almost intuitive, developed through thousands of hours of practice. Modern scientists can analyze Egyptian blue and tell you its exact chemical composition, but knowing the recipe isn't the same as being able to make it consistently, especially with ancient tools and techniques. That requires the kind of embodied knowledge that only comes from doing the work over and over, year after year. Or consider the precision of stone cutting. Some ancient Egyptian stone objects are cut and fitted with such precision that you can't slide a razor blade between adjoining pieces. The famous example is the sarcophagus of King Khafre, made from red granite polished to a mirror finish with perfectly vertical walls of even thickness throughout. How did they achieve this with copper tools and abrasive sand? Part of the answer is patience. Stone carving wasn't rushed. A major sarcophagus might be worked on for months or even years. Workers would use dolerite pounders to rough out the shape, then switch to copper saws with abrasive sand for finer shaping, then progress through increasingly fine abrasives for the final polishing. Each stage removed less material, but produced a finer surface. But it's not just patience, it's also incredible skill in reading the stone. Granite isn't uniform. It has harder and softer areas, crystal inclusions, subtle flaws. An experienced stone worker could see these variations and adjust their technique accordingly, applying more or less pressure, changing the angle of attack, working with the stone's natural properties rather than against them. They also developed sophisticated measuring techniques, even without precision instruments. They used plumb bobs to ensure vertical walls, water levels to check horizontal surfaces, and careful measurement with marked chords to maintain symmetry. For the interior hollowing of sarcophagi, they probably used drilling patterns, creating a grid of holes to a specific depth, then chiseling away the remaining material between holes, gradually working deeper until the desired internal dimensions were achieved. And here's something that really shows their geometric understanding. Many stone vessels have internal curves that don't match the external curves. The wall thickness varies to make the object balanced and aesthetically pleasing. Creating this requires three-dimensional visualization, understanding how removing stone from one area affects the shape and balance of the whole object. They were thinking in 3D without computer modeling, using only their spatial intelligence and experience. The granulation technique in goldwork presents another fascinating puzzle. Those tiny gold balls, sometimes smaller than grains of sand, all had to be the same size and had to be attached to a gold surface without melting into shapeless blobs. How did ancient goldsmiths achieve this? Modern recreations have shown one possible method. The gold granules were probably made by cutting gold into tiny pieces, placing them on a layer of charcoal, and heating until surface tension pulled each piece into a perfect sphere. The charcoal prevented oxidation and provided a surface the gold wouldn't stick to. Different sized pieces would produce different sized spheres, so careful cutting was essential. Attaching them was even trickier. If you heat gold hot enough to melt and fuse pieces together, tiny granules would simply melt into the base and disappear. The ancient goldsmiths probably used a clever technique involving copper salts. They'd mix a copper compound with an organic binder and apply tiny amounts at each joint. When heated, the copper would diffuse into the gold surfaces, locally lowering the melting point just enough to create a bond without melting the granules themselves. This is incredibly sophisticated metallurgy. They didn't understand the chemistry the way we do, in terms of atoms and alloys and phase diagrams, but they understood it practically, experientially. They knew what worked, even if they couldn't explain why in modern scientific terms, and that practical knowledge was just as effective as theoretical understanding for actually doing the work. The creation of glass presented similar challenges. Making glass requires heating silica sand to extremely high temperatures, well over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. Ancient Egyptian furnaces, fueled by charcoal or wood, couldn't normally reach such temperatures. So, how did they make glass? Part of the answer lies in flux materials. By adding compounds like natron or plant ash to the sand, they could lower the melting point significantly, making glass formation possible in their furnaces. They also probably used forced air, blowing into the furnace through pipes to increase temperature. Teams of workers might take turns blowing, maintaining a constant airflow that kept temperatures high enough. The coloured glass they produced required even more knowledge. Different metal oxides produced different colours: copper for blue and green, cobalt for deeper blue, manganese for purple and black. But these additives also affected how the glass behaved when heated and cooled. Too much cobalt and the glass might become brittle. The wrong form of copper might produce muddy colours instead of brilliant ones. Glassmakers had to learn these relationships through experience, probably having many failures before achieving consistent results. The fact that they succeeded, creating beautiful coloured glass objects that have survived for thousands of years, shows remarkable empirical knowledge and technical skill. The production of faience offers another window into ancient Egyptian chemical knowledge. Faience isn't quite pottery and isn't quite glass. It's something in between. The core is made from crushed quartz or sand mixed with a small amount of alkali and water formed into shape. But the glaze, that's where the magic happens. The glaze mixture includes copper compounds that will produce the characteristic blue or green colour when fired. But unlike modern glazing, where you apply glaze to the surface of an object, Egyptian faience glazing often happened automatically during firing. The alkali and copper compounds in the core material would migrate to the surface during heating, forming a glaze layer as the object cooled. This self-glazing process requires precise control of the core mixture and the firing temperature. Too much alkali and the object might disintegrate. Too little and no glaze forms. The temperature has to be high enough to vitrify the surface, but not so high that the object melts. Ancient faience makers mastered this process to the point where they could create complex shapes, multiple colours in one object, and consistently successful results. The linen production process also involved sophisticated technical knowledge. Flax fibres are naturally stiff and brittle when dry. To create thread that's strong, flexible, and fine enough for the sheer linen the Egyptians prized, the fibres had to be processed carefully. The retting process, where flax stems were soaked in water, was crucial. Too little retting, and the fibres wouldn't separate properly. Too much, and the fibres would weaken or rot. Weavers learned to judge by feel, touch, and appearance when fibres were properly retted. Then came the heckling process, combing the fibers to remove short bits and align the long ones. The amount of heckling affected the final thread quality. More heckling produced finer, more uniform thread, but wasted more material. Weavers had to balance quality against efficiency. Spinning technique also mattered enormously. The twist in thread, how tightly the fibers are wound together, affects strength and appearance. Too loose and the thread is weak. Too tight and it's prone to kinking and tangling. Skilled spinners learn to maintain consistent twist, producing thread of uniform thickness and strength throughout. The finest Egyptian linen, some of it so sheer you could see through it, required all of this knowledge applied at the highest level. The flax had to be grown properly, harvested at the right time, retted perfectly, heckled thoroughly, spun with incredible skill, and finally woven with precision and care. It took a chain of skilled workers, each doing their part excellently, to create the ultimate product. Woodworking, too, required knowledge that's easy to overlook. Wood isn't a uniform material. It has grain, knots, areas of different hardness. It expands and contracts with changes in humidity. It can warp, split, or crack if not handled properly. Ancient Egyptian carpenters understood all this through experience. They learned which woods were best for different purposes. Acacia for objects needing hardness and durability. Sycamore fig for items that would be carved or shaped extensively. Cedar for important furniture where straight grain and pleasant scent mattered. They learned to work with the grain, not against it, letting the natural properties of the wood guide their techniques. Joinery techniques show remarkable sophistication. Mortise and tenon joints, where a projection from one piece fits into a hole in another, require precision cutting. The tenon has to be exactly the right size. Too large and it won't fit, too small and the joint is weak. Ancient carpenters achieved this precision using bronze saws and chisels, marking carefully with measuring tools, testing fits, and adjusting until everything was perfect. Dovetail joints, where interlocking wedge-shaped cuts hold pieces together, are even more complex. The angles have to be precise, the cuts clean. Done right, a dovetail joint is incredibly strong and can last for thousands of years. We know ancient Egyptian carpenters mastered this because furniture from tombs, pieces that are over 3,000 years old, still have tight dovetail joints. The knowledge required for all these crafts wasn't written down in detail. We have no ancient Egyptian craft manuals explaining step by step how to make Egyptian blue or cut a perfect dovetail joint. The knowledge was passed down through demonstration and practice, master to apprentice, generation after generation. This oral and practical transmission worked remarkably well, maintaining technical standards over centuries. But it also meant knowledge could be fragile. If a particular technique was known to only a few masters and they died without passing it on, the technique could be lost. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record. Certain sophisticated techniques appear in one period, disappear, and then reappear later, suggesting they were lost and had to be reinvented or reintroduced from elsewhere. The economic context of craft production is also important to understand. Artisans didn't work in a vacuum. They were part of complex economic systems involving resource extraction, material processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal. Understanding these systems helps us appreciate the full scope of what ancient Egyptian crafts represented. Take gold, for instance. Before a goldsmith could work their magic, someone had to find the gold, mine it, refine it, and transport it to where the goldsmith worked. Egypt had rich gold deposits, especially in Nubia and the eastern desert, but accessing them required organized mining operations. Workers, probably a mix of conscripts and specialists, would travel to remote, harsh desert locations to extract gold-bearing ore. The ore then had to be processed. Gold ore isn't pure gold, it's rock containing gold particles. The rock had to be crushed, often by pounding it with stone hammers on grinding slabs. Then the crushed material was washed, using water to separate the heavier gold particles from the lighter rock debris. This process, called panning, is ancient and effective but labor-intensive. Once gold was separated from ore, it often contained silver and other impurities. Ancient Egyptians developed techniques to refine gold to higher purity, probably involving repeated heating and hammering, possibly using salts that would combine with silver and other metals, allowing them to be removed. The result was gold of various purities, with the purest reserved for the most important objects. All of this happened before the goldsmith even received their raw material. Similar chains existed for every material. Stone had to be quarried, sometimes from sites hundreds of miles from where it would be used. Huge blocks had to be extracted from quarries using copper tools and wooden wedges, then transported by boat down the Nile or dragged overland on sledges. Copper ore had to be mined, smelted to extract the metal, and cast into ingots for distribution. Pigment materials had to be collected from various sources, processed into usable form, and distributed to painters. Each step in these chains required labor, organization, and expertise. The final craftsman was the visible culmination of a much larger economic system. When you see a gold pectoral in a museum, you're seeing not just the goldsmith's skill but the work of miners, refiners, transporters, and others whose labor made the final object possible. This economic complexity also meant craft production was embedded in larger social and political systems. The state controlled many resources, especially precious ones like gold and copper. Access to these materials meant access to state patronage and state control. Royal workshops, attached to temples and palaces, had privileged access to the best materials and worked on the most important commissions. But there was also a private market for craft goods. Artisans made things for non-royal customers, trading their products for food, clothing, and other goods in a barter economy. This private production gave artisans some economic independence, though they still depended ultimately on the larger systems that provided raw materials. The balance between state and private work varied over time and between crafts. During strong periods of royal power, state workshops might dominate, with most skilled artisans working on royal projects. During weaker periods or in smaller settlements far from royal centres, private production might be more important. Artisans probably navigated between these sectors, doing state work when it was available and lucrative, private work when it offered better opportunities. The social networks artisans created were also economically important. Craft families intermarried, creating alliances and support systems. Neighbours helped each other, lending tools, sharing materials, offering advice. These informal networks reduced risk and increased efficiency. If your kiln broke, you might use a neighbour's until yours was repaired. If you ran short of a particular pigment, you might borrow from another painter and reciprocate later. These networks also facilitated knowledge sharing. A stone carver who discovered a better technique for polishing granite might share it with colleagues who would reciprocate with their own innovations. Over time, the accumulated knowledge of the community increased, benefiting everyone. This cooperative aspect coexisted with competition. Artisans competed for commissions and recognition, but they also cooperated in ways that strengthened their entire community. The religious framework that surrounded craft work also had economic implications. Temples were major consumers of craft goods, requiring vast quantities of items for rituals, decoration, and burial practices. Temple workshops produced many of these items, but temples also commissioned work from independent artisans. This provided steady demand and economic stability for craftsmen. Religious festivals created peaks in demand. Before major festivals, there would be increased need for new cult statues, ceremonial furniture, ritual implements, decorative items. Craftsmen who could meet these deadlines and quality requirements found reliable income. The religious calendar thus structured economic activity, creating rhythms of busy and slower periods. The relationship between craftsmen and their patrons was also complex. For royal commissions, the relationship was formal and hierarchical. The artisan was serving the state and the pharaoh, with limited room for negotiation or personal expression. The work had to meet strict standards and follow established conventions, but this also brought prestige and usually good compensation. For private commissions, relationships could be more personal. A craftsman might work with the same families over years, creating tomb equipment, furniture, jewellery. These longer-term relationships built trust and understanding. The craftsman learned what the family liked, and the family knew they could rely on the craftsman's quality. This personal element probably made the work more satisfying in some ways, even if it paid less than royal commissions. Disputes between craftsmen and patrons sometimes arose. What if the patron wasn't satisfied with the work? What if the craftsmen felt they weren't being paid fairly? Records hint at such conflicts, though we don't know details of how they were typically resolved. Probably a mix of negotiation, arbitration by respected community members, and sometimes formal legal proceedings. The training of new craftsmen was itself an economic activity. Taking on apprentices meant feeding and housing them, providing materials for practice, spending time teaching rather than producing finished goods. In return, the master got labour from the apprentice, someone to help with basic tasks, and eventually a skilled colleague who might join the workshop or at least remember their training and provide future cooperation. Some apprenticeships were formal arrangements with the apprentice's family paying the master for training. This was common when families wanted their sons to learn a craft different from the family tradition. Other times, apprenticeships were within families, with sons learning from fathers without formal payment, but with the understanding that sons would support parents in old age and maintain the family business. The pace of work varied depending on many factors. Rush jobs, needed for a funeral that couldn't be delayed, might require working longer hours, perhaps even through the night. Such intense work would be compensated with extra rations or other benefits. Routine work followed more relaxed schedules, with the standard 8-day weeks and regular rest days. Seasonal variations also affected work rhythms. The annual Nile flood, usually from July to October, disrupted normal life. Fields were underwater, so agricultural work stopped. This was actually a good time for quarrying and construction because workers from farms were available and could be conscripted for state projects. Craft workers in permanent positions continued their regular work, but there might be more demand for some items and less for others. The hot summer months, from May through early July, were probably the most unpleasant time for craftsmen, especially those working in enclosed spaces like tombs or workshops. The heat would be intense, making physical work exhausting and affecting materials. Metals would be hotter to handle. Paint would dry faster, potentially before it could be properly applied. Woodworkers would have to account for wood shrinking in the dry heat. Experienced craftsmen learned to adjust their techniques for seasonal variations. Cooler months, from November through March, offered more pleasant working conditions. This was probably when the most demanding work was scheduled when possible. The king's birthday or coronation anniversary might involve major festivals requiring new craft items, and these dates were known in advance, allowing craftsmen to plan their work during favourable seasons. The tools craftsmen used were themselves products of other crafts. Bronze tools came from metal workers, wooden tool handles from carpenters, stone grinding surfaces from stone workers. This interconnection meant craftsmen depended on each other, creating a web of economic relationships. A stone carver needed good bronze chisels from a metal worker, who needed stone moulds from a stone worker, who needed copper to make tools to create the moulds. Everyone relied on everyone else. Tool quality mattered enormously. A well-made chisel that held its edge would speed work and improve results. A poorly made one that needed constant resharpening wasted time and produced inferior work. Master craftsmen probably invested in the best tools they could get, knowing that good tools were essential to good work, and that they would last for years if properly maintained. Maintenance of tools was a constant requirement. Bronze blades needed regular sharpening. Wooden handles needed replacement when they cracked or wore out. Stone tools needed reshaping as they wore down. Some of this maintenance craftsmen could do themselves. For more complex work, like recasting a damaged bronze tool, they might need to hire a specialist. Time and resources spent on tool maintenance were necessary investments in continued productivity. The physical spaces where craftsmen worked varied widely. Royal workshops were probably purpose-built structures with good light, ventilation, and space. They might have separate areas for different stages of work. A dirty area for initial stone cutting, a cleaner area for fine carving, a separate space for painting. Storage areas would hold materials and finished works awaiting delivery. Home workshops, common for independent craftsmen, had to fit into domestic spaces. A room of the house might serve as a workshop, or work might happen in a courtyard or on a roof. This meant less space and less separation between work and domestic life, but also more flexibility and lower overhead costs. Some crafts required specific facilities. Potters needed kilns, substantial structures that took time and resources to build. A potter's workshop would be organized around the kiln, with clay preparation areas, drying spaces, and storage for finished pottery. Metal workers needed furnaces that could reach high temperatures, again requiring specialized construction. These facility requirements meant such craftsmen were less mobile. They couldn't easily relocate because they'd have to rebuild their kilns or furnaces. Other crafts were more portable. A jeweler's basic tools were small enough to pack in a basket. A painter could carry brushes and pigment pots. These crafts could be practiced anywhere with reasonable light. This portability meant such craftsmen could more easily work at different locations, perhaps travelling to a noble's estate to work on site rather than requiring materials to be brought to them. The specialization within crafts created hierarchies of skill and prestige. Among goldsmiths, those who could do granulation or create the finest filigree were probably more valued than those who only did basic hammering. Among stoneworkers, those who could work hard stones like granite were probably more respected than those who only worked soft limestone. Within painting, those who could depict complex scenes and hieroglyphs were surely more valued than those who only applied flat colours. These hierarchies were probably informal but real. They affected who got the best commissions, who was consulted on difficult problems, who was chosen to train the most promising apprentices. They also probably affected compensation, though we don't have detailed records of pay scales within crafts. Master craftsmen at the top of their professions achieved status beyond mere technical skill. They became authorities, people whose opinions were sought and respected. They might be consulted on design questions, asked to evaluate other craftsmen's work, invited to plan major projects. This advisory role was probably satisfying. Recognition that their expertise extended beyond their hands to their knowledge and judgment. Some craftsmen seem to have achieved lasting reputations. Names of particular architects and artists occasionally appear in records, suggesting they were famous in their time. Imhotep, architect of the Step Pyramid, was so renowned he was eventually deified. Most craftsmen couldn't aspire to such heights, but even being well known and respected within their community or region was a form of success. The relationship between innovation and tradition in craft work was complex. Egyptian art and craft had strong conventions. Gods had to be depicted in specific ways. Hieroglyphs followed strict rules. Architectural forms were traditional. Within these constraints, how much room was there for innovation? More than you might think. While the overall forms were conventional, details could vary. The exact pattern of a decorative border, the specific pose of a figure within established parameters, the arrangement of elements in a composition, these offered spaces for creativity. Master craftsmen learned to work expressively within conventions, creating work that was recognizably traditional but also distinctively excellent. Technical innovation also happened, though it's often invisible in the finished product. A new way of mixing pigments that produced better color, a refined technique for drilling stone that was faster or more precise, an improved joint design in carpentry. These innovations might not change how the finished object looked, but they made production more efficient or reliable. Some periods saw more innovation than others. The early New Kingdom, for instance, saw the development of new glass-making techniques and innovations in bronze metallurgy. These weren't random. They probably resulted from increased contact with other cultures through trade and conquest, exposing Egyptian craftsmen to foreign techniques that they adapted and integrated into their own traditions. But the overall conservatism of Egyptian craft served important purposes. In a culture where religious correctness was paramount, where tomb paintings and texts had to be exactly right to serve their magical purposes, maintaining traditional forms made sense. Innovation had to be balanced against the risk of doing something wrong, of offending the gods or failing in the sacred purposes the work served. This conservatism also provided quality control. Traditional techniques were proven. Everyone knew they worked. Young craftsmen learning these methods were building on centuries of accumulated knowledge. While this might have limited radical innovation, it ensured consistent excellence. And that consistency, that reliability, was itself valuable. The legacy these craftsmen left extends far beyond the objects we see in museums. They developed techniques that influenced craft traditions throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Egyptian jewelry-making methods spread to Greece and Rome. Egyptian stoneworking techniques influenced later civilizations. The concept of organized craft workshops with specialized workers and quality control systems became models for later industrial organization. More subtly, they left a legacy of valuing excellence, of caring about quality, of understanding that difficult things done well create value that transcends immediate utility. When you look at an Egyptian artifact, you're not just seeing an old object. You're seeing the result of someone caring deeply about their work, someone who spent hours or days or weeks perfecting details that they knew most people would never notice, but that they knew mattered. That attitude, that commitment to excellence for its own sake, that understanding that quality in work has intrinsic value that's perhaps the most important legacy these craftsmen left us. In our modern world, where we're constantly encouraged to do things faster, cheaper, with less effort, the ancient Egyptian artisans remind us that there's another way, that doing things well, taking the time to get details right, developing deep expertise, and applying it with care, that these things create value that lasts. So when you encounter ancient Egyptian crafts, whether in person at a museum or in photographs and descriptions, remember the human hands that created them. Remember the goldsmiths squinting in lamplight as they positioned tiny granules. Remember the stone carver covered in dust, arms aching from endless pounding. Remember the painter carefully mixing the perfect shade of blue, the weaver passing threads 10,000 times to create a single length of cloth, the carpenter fitting joints that would still be tight thousands of years later. Remember that these were people, as human as we are, who found meaning and purpose in their work despite its difficulties, who took pride in doing things excellently, who believed their crafts served eternal purposes and worked accordingly, who created beauty that has outlasted their civilization and continues to inspire wonder and admiration thousands of years after they set down their tools for the last time. They were masters of creation, these craftsmen and artisans of ancient Egypt, not because they were superhuman or because they had lost technologies we can't understand. They were masters because they devoted themselves completely to their crafts, learning deeply, practicing endlessly, and caring profoundly about the quality of what they created. That dedication, that commitment to excellence, that understanding that work well done matters, that's their true masterpiece. And it's a lesson that remains as relevant and valuable today as it was when these artisans walked the dusty streets of their workers' villages 3,000 years ago, carrying their tools and their knowledge, heading to another day of creating things meant to last forever.